All right, guys. So, like I said in the module 4 introduction, we're going to shift gears a little bit towards, much more scientific principles and understandings. We're going to go through the aerobic training adaptation. So, really, what it is, aerobic endurance training, what it is, how does your body respond both in acute and chronic way, and then basically how to program for aerobic training. So this is a pretty dense chapter and lecture, so you might have to rewind it a few times. But as always, feel free to send me a message if you have any questions as far as the material. All right, so I got to move this. There we go. All right, so aerobic training. There are minor differences, but we're gonna just say aerobic training, endurance training, same thing for right now. So what is it? Exercise that may be performed for prolonged periods of time without excessive fatigue. Okay. And there's two basically different types of endurance training. We can talk about basically general endurance training, which would be fall under the cardiorespiratory endurance, or we can talk about muscular endurance training, which is basically specific, either specific muscle or muscle groups. Okay, so for instance, cardiorespiratory endurance would be like running, cycling, triathlon. Whereas muscular endurance, you can see these sports here: wrestling, boxing, circuit training. But also you can think of it as like the old military fitness test would have been push-ups and sit-ups, which were more muscular endurance. And then the mile run, I think it was a mile, maybe it was two, was cardiorespiratory endurance. Okay, so just a little bit of differentiation between the two. So, but either way, regardless of which one it is, aerobic training occurs at low intensities, which basically gives us enough time to replenish ATP, okay, adenosine triphosphate, through oxidative energy systems. And just to keep it simple, if you haven't taken physiology or exercise physiology, we basically have aerobic metabolism, anaerobic metabolism. So the prefix "an" means without. Aerobic means essentially oxygen. So aerobic training is we have enough oxygen. Anaerobic, without oxygen, we basically don't have enough oxygen to replenish our ATP. That's essentially the difference. Okay, so remember, aerobic training, endurance training, low intensity, which allows us to replenish our ATP because we're using the oxidative energy system. Okay. There you can see submax muscle contractions over large repetitions with little recovery. And here you can see this red box. This is basically the zone we're talking about when we're talking about aerobic training. Okay. Very high contribution of the aerobic system, very little contribution of anaerobic. So remember, difference between the two: with oxygen, without oxygen. Okay. And here you can see if I move this thing, also the same thing on this side. Just sort of given a breakdown of different percentages of our energy system, what our time frame is, and then some sports that fall in that category. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the cardiovascular system. Really, there's two main primary functions of the cardiovascular system. One is to deliver nutrients to the muscles that are working, and then the other is to remove our waste products. Okay. And then we're going to break this down a little bit more. So the cardiovascular system is basically made up of two different things, and we call it cardiac output. So cardiac output right here, and it's symbolized by the letter Q, capital Q. To be honest with you, I don't know why capital Q, but that's what it is. But cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the heart per minute. Okay. And there's two different factors that go into there. One is stroke volume down here, SV. That's the actual amount of blood pumped by the heart each beat. So the physical amount of blood pumped per heart with each single beat. And then heart rate, I think everyone probably knows what heart rate is, but that's the actual amount of beats per minute. So cardiac output is a function of heart rate and stroke volume. So how fast your heart is beating and how much blood can be ejected with each individual pump. That's cardiac output. Okay, move that over. So just a quick anatomy lesson. Anatomy of the cardiovascular system. There's 4 different chambers within the heart. Okay, you have the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Okay, so 2 different sides, right and left, 2 different types or chambers of the heart, atrium, ventricle. Okay, so the atria will always receive blood. Atria will always receive, while the ventricles will always pump blood away. Okay, and then finally, the veins carry the blood to the heart, arteries away from the heart. Okay, so this is a really good visual. I like it a lot, but we're going to start down here and we're going to take it clockwise. Okay, so first, all the veins are going to return our blood that's unoxygenated. It basically needs oxygen back. Remember, atria receives blood. So we're going to go right into the right atria. Okay, travels back, boom. We're going to go down to the ventricle. Again, the ventricle pumps blood away. So the right ventricle pumps the blood up into the lungs where it gets oxygenated. Okay, and then we're going to send that back down to the heart. Remember, atrium receives blood. So we're going to go into the left atrium. Then we're going to go right down into the left ventricle. Remember, ventricle away. So the left ventricle pumps it to the rest of the body. Okay, so it basically has a little system where it gets oxygenated, boom, pumped out. Okay. All right, switching gears real quick, but blood pressure. Okay, 2 different types of blood pressure, and this is based on the beat of the heart. Okay, systolic blood pressure is the pressure against the arterial walls. Arterial walls. Remember, arterial walls are the vessels that are sending blood to the rest of the body. Okay, so pressure against the arterial walls as the blood is ejected from the heart, so forcefully ejected. So as it's pumped out of the heart, boom, that's the pressure in our arterial walls. Diastolic blood pressure is basically the pressure between the beats. Okay, so basically pressure when no blood is actually being ejected, being sent through. Okay. Oxygen consumption. Okay, so the volume of oxygen consumed by the body's tissues, okay, which is not the same thing as the amount of oxygen you're breathing in. Okay, because the main difference is, yes, you might be able to breathe in a lot of blood, or a lot of oxygen, but your body still has to consume that. And that, depending on what you're doing, your genetics, etc., sometimes you can utilize oxygen a little bit better, but also, as we'll see later on, also dependent on training. Okay, so the VO2, or the volume of oxygen consumed by the body's tissues, is related to the mass of the exercising muscle. So remember, are we talking about cycling where he's using legs? This particular guy is using legs, a lot of muscle mass in those legs. Or are we talking about maybe upper body ergometer? So arms, a lot less muscle mass. Metabolic efficiency, exercise intensity, all relate to our VO2. Okay, and you guys have probably heard of VO2 max. If you haven't, we'll talk about it, but you're gonna touch upon that later when you have an assessment class. You're probably, one of you, if not multiple of you are going to administer and take a VO2 max test. I've taken quite a few of them. Not really my cup of tea, but some people enjoy them. But it is a good experience. So I would suggest you doing that if you have the opportunity. But VO2 max, essentially, if VO2 is the volume of oxygen consumed by the body's tissues, VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that can be consumed by the body's tissues. So the max amount. Okay. And this is usually measured using a graded exercise test. You can click on this link and you'll see it's 5 or 6 minute video of a graded exercise test. It's a little old, the video, but it's on a treadmill. And that's almost identical to what you're going to be doing in the lab in your future studies, future classes with assessment. Okay, there you can see some normal values, as well as the highest ever recorded, which is pretty ridiculous, but quite a big bit of range. Okay. All right, so VO2 max in the cardiovascular system. So why we talked about that. VO2 max is the gold standard for cardiorespiratory fitness tests. If you talk to any athlete from some kind of cardio-based sport, even soccer, where endurance is a huge factor, but you talk about cycling, triathlon, swimming, etc., long distance swimming, VO2 max is that gold standard. And why is that a gold standard? Okay, here we can see the equation of VO2 max. So we got cardiac output, which we talked about earlier, heart rate times stroke volume, times AVO2 difference. AVO2 difference is basically the amount of oxygen we can pull out of the blood as it comes through. So arterial oxygen concentration minus venous. So arterial, remember, it's getting sent to, in this case, the muscle tissue while we're exercising. And then the venous is how much oxygen is going back. Okay, so just in simple terms, if we have 10 O2 concentration and we have 0 O2 venous O2 concentration, well, we utilized all of our oxygen. That doesn't usually happen, even in the best athletes. They're not going to take out all the oxygen, but better athletes can remove more oxygen from the arterioles, and then they're sending back less in the veins. Okay, so VO2 max is the product of the output of the heart. So remember, cardiac output, and the amount of oxygen unloaded to the tissues. If we increase either one of these variables, we can alter VO2 max and consequently improve performance. Okay, that's the ultimate goal of endurance training. Now, if you're talking about elite athletes where they all have similar VO2 maxes, well, then we have to start getting into some a lot more specific training for their needs. And we'll talk about it a bit in a second. But pretty much the ultimate goal of endurance training is to increase that VO2 max. Okay. All right, so the cardiovascular system during exercise. Okay, this is a pretty good graph here that shows us some things, but so basically as we progress from rest to steady state exercise, the cardiovascular system. What do we mean by steady state exercise? That would be like if I went to the rec center or hopped on a bike or something and basically went at the same intensity. So I just put that treadmill up to 7 miles per hour and start jogging, and I'm staying there for half hour or so. So that's steady state. I'm not increasing my intensity at all. So steady state. Okay. So as we progress from rest to steady state, our cardiac output increases rapidly. So it increases a lot at first during lower intensity exercise, and then it's going to plateau. And why is that? Because stroke volume is also going to increase, and then it's going to plateau as well. So because stroke volume is 1/2 of the equation of cardiac output, that's why we're going to get that plateau. Okay. And then heart rate is going to increase linearly until we reach our max heart rate. So here's this graph. I should have drawn it in there, to be honest with you. Heart rate is going to increase linearly. It's going to keep increasing until we hit that max heart rate. Stroke volume increases rapidly at first, and then it plateaus. So because cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate, we're going to be somewhere in the middle. We're going to be right here. Boom, we're going to increase cardiac output, and then we're going to plateau. Maybe not as much, but we're going to plateau right around here. Okay. And that's because we have a combination of stroke volume and heart rate. Okay. All right. Respiratory responses. Okay. Now we're talking about actual breathing of air. Okay. During exercise, the volume of air inspired per minute is going to increase. And there's two different reasons. We're going to increase the depth of the breathing. So basically deeper breaths. So they're not shallow, they're deeper. And then obviously increased frequency of breathing is the amount that we're breathing per minute. Okay. At low to moderate intensity exercises is primarily due to increased depth or tidal volume. So we're breathing deeper at low to moderate intensity. Now, during intense maximal exercise, we also have increased breathing frequency. So we're going to have tidal volume increase, breathing rate also increase during max intense exercise. Okay, and there you can see some general percentages. All right, lactate threshold. Okay, I know we're flying through this, guys. Again, ask me if you got any questions. This is just a brief overview of aerobic adaptations and training. Okay, so the lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. So if we were in person, I'd give you guys a pop quiz now. Again, what's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic? Aerobic, the presence of oxygen. We have enough oxygen that we can replenish ATP. Anaerobic, that means without oxygen. So we don't have enough oxygen to replenish our ATP. Okay, so when we transition from aerobic to anaerobic, we're increasing our intensity of exercise, and we're not going to be able to last quite as long when we're in anaerobic training, anaerobic metabolism as compared to aerobic. Okay, so the muscles are unable to maintain the balance between energy production and energy demand through aerobic metabolism. What that's saying is basically we don't have enough oxygen to produce enough energy. Okay, so the muscles must rely on anaerobic metabolism as intensity increases. And due to this, our blood lactate accumulates. So you guys have probably experienced this before, maybe during a lactate test, but if not, go out and run a 400-meter sprint as fast as you can on the track. You're going to feel some lactate in your legs. Okay, do an all-out sprint for 30 seconds. There's a wind gate. Again, I go back to this assessment class. This is everything's gonna start tying in together with this major, which is great. You're gonna do a wind gate test, which is a 30-second all-out bike test. Again, not fun at all. I've done it multiple times, but I do think it's something that you guys should experience, whether as a person who's running the test, but also as somebody who's actually doing the test. But that's a test of basically anaerobic power, 30 seconds of all-out power. Okay, so during those tests, you're going to have a lot of blood lactate. Okay, because we don't have enough oxygen. The pyruvate gets converted to lactate. Okay, so it says very trainable and a good indicator of endurance performance. So I think it's, let me check. Yep, next slide. I'm going to talk about trainable. But now this is also a good indicator of endurance performance. So basically, VO2 max is sort of that gold standard. If person A has a higher VO2 max than person B, everything else being equal, person A is probably going to win the race, win that endurance event. Now, if you have two individuals, A and B, both have the same VO2 max, now the lactate threshold or the anaerobic threshold might be a good indicator. So if person A now has a lower, remember they both have VO2 maxes of the same, person A has a lower lactate threshold than person B is probably going to win that race. And I'm going to show you why in a second. Okay. Well, there you can see in words. I'm more of a picture guy, so I'll show you guys. Well, this is trained versus untrained. We can look at this as two different individuals, but we'll just look at it as trained versus untrained, just like the graph shows. Okay. So essentially what this is saying is we can look at it two ways. If we are working at the same work rate, so let's go 300 watts. So that would be like you hop on a bike and you're training at 300 watts. Okay. Untrained individual produces what, 4.23 millimoles per liter of lactate, as compared to a trained individual is producing about 1.5 millimoles per liter. So what does that signify? Again, another pop quiz if I was there in person. What does that signify? That signifies the trained individual, or that same individual that is now trained, is able to maintain aerobic metabolism for a lot longer, or they're able to not move into anaerobic metabolism at the same work rate. Okay. Again, what happens when we go into anaerobic metabolism? We start producing lactate, and our body can't continue exercising for quite as long. Aerobic metabolism, we can go for a long time. Okay. Once we start going into anaerobic, and then if we continue pushing it and producing more lactate, we're going to go downhill. That's why you can't sprint your 100-meter speed for 5 miles, because your body cannot, you don't have enough oxygen to produce that ATP. Okay. So remember, a trained individual is going to produce lower blood lactate at the same work rate or the same wattage. Or you can look at it another way. So you can see this arrow. Trained individual can, let's just say we're going to the same amount of blood lactate. So what is this? 2.5 right here, millimoles per liter in the blood. So after an individual goes through a training program, that individual now, where they could work at 275 watts while they're producing that certain lactate, now they can work at 325 watts. So they have more power at the same lactate level. So more power, most of the time in athletics, is a good thing. You're probably going to win. Okay, so that's a lactate threshold. So with training, we can move or shift that lactate threshold up and to the right. All right, physiological adaptations. Okay, so with aerobic training, we can positively affect the ability of the body to supply ATP. Okay, I think we all know that intrinsically. Okay, and people who are less trained, so beginners, are going to have a lot more significant gains than experienced athletes, just like resistance training. This guy, you know, he's probably making, I don't know how much he's squatting, but 10 pounds in a year would be a significant increase in his 1 rep max. I would imagine. I'm not sure, but I would imagine. Okay. As compared to a beginner, shoot, just because of neurological adaptations, they can increase their 1 rep max 10 pounds in a few weeks. Okay. Same thing with the aerobic endurance training. Okay. This individual might, his PR, he might PR by a few seconds in the Boston Marathon, whereas a beginner, they might be able to shave minutes off their time. Okay. There we can see cardiovascular adaptations. You can read through those. I'm not going to read through them. I think we've covered these. Oh, I do want to note with this slide before I move on. Acute, basically we're talking about acute changes versus adaptation. So I just wanted to I should have clarified it before, but acute changes are basically what happens in one single training session. Okay, so that would be like we talked about, our cardiac output increases because our stroke volume increases and then plateaus, our heart rate increases. So those are acute changes. Adaptations are long-term changes. So this would be after maybe a 12, 16-week training program. Okay, so I guess I will touch on these. Increase blood flow to exercising muscle. So we're going to be able to increase blood flow. Capillary density is just the amount of capillaries per volume. Decrease blood pressure. Decrease heart rate at rest and during submax exercise. Okay, so we're going to have a lower heart rate at rest and submax exercise, but still our max heart rate should be unchanged. And this, I just wanted to touch on this. If our heart rate max changes, that might be a sign of overtraining. Okay, so increased blood volume and hemoglobin concentration. So we're basically able to carry more oxygen throughout the body, increase cardiac output, and increase stroke volume. Okay, we're able to pump more volume, more blood with each beat of the heart, which in turn increases our cardiac output. Okay, there you can just see some numbers before training, after training, and then compared to elite endurance athletes. Muscle fiber types, just want to touch upon these real quick. We're going to touch upon them a lot more, but muscle fiber types, okay? So basically our type 1 are referred to as slow twitch muscle fibers. Type 2 are more the fast twitch muscle fibers, okay? And there you can see this graph is basically depending on the amount of electrical threshold required to recruit these motor units, okay? Or a motor unit innervates a muscle fiber. So essentially, what's the threshold to recruit a muscle fiber, okay? Aerobic endurance training, as we can see here, does not require a lot of force, and it's pretty easy to recruit these muscle fibers. They're very low threshold, most of them. So we're talking about primarily type 1 muscle fibers. Slow twitch, they have a lot of fatigue resistance, but they can repeat low force production a lot over time. Okay. Well, I guess I gave you the answer to that. So there you go. And a better explanation to this, you can see this YouTube video, a couple minutes. Good video to explain our muscle fibers. And there you can see, if you guys can see it, characteristics of the 3 different muscle fiber types. Okay, you can go through, and remember, when we're talking about aerobic training, we're primarily talking about type 1 muscle fibers. Okay, muscle fibers would be those more slow twitch. Okay, a lot of muscle fibers, just so you guys know, is genetically, they're genetically predetermined. We might have very small shifts within, but let's say you're born with primarily type 2X muscle fibers, you're not going to be able to transition all those down to type 1. You might be able to increase your fatigue resistance a little bit, but not all the way down to where you're, winning the Boston Marathon or the Tour de France. Okay. And the reverse is also true. If you're born with primarily slow twitch muscle fibers, probably not going to beat Usain Bolt in a race. Okay. If that were the case, if you could just switch, I would change almost all my type 1 fibers into type 2X. That's just what I enjoy. I like fast, powerful stuff, but that's not the case. Do what you can to improve your force production, in my case, but yeah, you can't really change all the way up or all the way down. All right, metabolic and musculoskeletal adaptations. Remember, adaptations, changes that actually take place in our physiology over time. Okay, increase in the mitochondrial size and number. In other words, we're going to increase mitochondrial density, okay, our energy producing source in the cell. Increase our oxidative enzymes, okay, increase our capillary density. Reliance on stored fat. Remember, fat is primarily used for low intensity, but it gives us a lot of energy production per gram. Okay, maybe an increase in myoglobin content, and then ability to exercise at higher relative percentage of VO2 max. Okay, exercise economy basically encompasses a lot of different things, as you can see: training, environment, physiology, biomechanics, anthropometrics. Okay, I don't need you guys to memorize these, but running economy essentially is how efficient we are at running. Okay, obviously over time we're going to get more efficient. So not only are we changing our physiology, but now we're becoming more efficient, so we're not using as much energy per output. Okay, finally, program design for aerobic adaptations. Okay, we have to consider the mode, frequency, intensity, duration, and progression. Okay, so frequency, just the number of training sessions per week or per day. Okay, and this is dependent on the intensity and duration. Okay, so if we have more intense exercise sessions, we're probably going to have less frequent. If we have longer duration exercise sessions, again, we might have different frequencies. Okay, training status and sport season is a big factor when it comes to frequency. Okay, and there you can see 2 times per week was just as effective as 5 times per week for increasing VO2 max. And forgive me, I can't remember what the population was, so I would look that up if I were you, using the things we learned in the past couple of weeks as far as looking up articles. But for increasing VO2 max, remember we don't have to go out every single day to do that. Okay. Intensity is basically the difficulty level of the exercise. And here you can see this graph. There's an inverse relationship between intensity and volume. As intensity increases, our volume is going to go down, just like resistance training or any kind of training. Okay, that's what I said sprinting before. Sprinting, all out sprint, very intense up on this part of the graph. Volume's got to be low. I can't maintain that for a long period of time. Okay, so it's important to balance that intensity and duration. Okay, you can read through these, the benefits of different types of training, and we're going to talk about different types of training here in a couple slides. Calculating aerobic exercise intensity. Now, the great thing about wearables, wearable technology, is that it gives us our heart rate, I mean, right there on our watch very easily. Okay, but in general, 70% of max heart rate is a good rough estimate of heart rate, percentage of max heart rate to shoot for if we're talking about aerobic training. Now, this is going to vary depending on the type of exercise, but there's a good general starting point to aim for with aerobic training. Okay, and you could go through these. If you're not sure with these numbers, just let me know. Time is simply the duration of exercise. Again, there's a balance between frequency, intensity, duration. Okay, so as we can see here, it must be balanced with intensity. We're not really sure what duration is best. Different mode or different types of exercise require different durations. Okay, the mode is simply what method we're using to train. Okay, now this is something I cover quite a bit. I mean, all these I cover quite a bit in my strength conditioning class, but if you're a swimmer, you should primarily be training in the water when it comes to technique work and aerobic work and even some sprint work. Now, obviously, they're going to have some land training, resistance training, stuff like that, but that's the most similar to their sport, so they should do that. Same thing with a cyclist. There's nothing saying a cyclist can't swim a little bit or run a little bit for training or cross training, but the primary focus of his or her training should be on the bike. Okay. And then cross training is where we talked about, or where we're going to talk about those, like I just said, the cyclist that does some swimming. That's cross training. That's not his or her primary event, but just to switch things up, to reduce burnout, reduce the likelihood of injury. Maybe they are injured and they can't bike, so hop in the pool and do some swimming. It's a perfect time to do some cross training. Okay. And then progression. We have to progress any type of training. We have to progress. So if we start off and we're sedentary, completely sedentary, if we go for a 5 or 10 minute walk every single day, yeah, we're going to have aerobic adaptations. That's low intensity training. But over time, if a year from now, we're still only walking 5 or 10 minutes, we're not going to see these adaptations occur anymore. So we would have to, maybe we increase the frequency. Now we're doing it every single day instead of 3 days a week. Or maybe we increase the intensity. Now we're more power walking. Or the duration, that's an easy one. Now we're going to walk 10 or 20 minutes instead of 5 or 10. Okay. So it's usually for aerobic adaptations or aerobic training, we're going to have some kind of combination of these. And we don't want to increase our total work by more than 10%. So that would be like increasing frequency, intensity, and duration in the same week. We probably don't want to do that. We probably want to say, okay, I'm going to increase the frequency this week. Intensity and duration is going to stay the same. Okay, maybe next week frequency and duration are going to stay the same, but I'm going to increase my intensity. Okay. And then here we can see this, the training methods. Okay. We go from long, slow distance, as the name implies. We're going to go a long time, so a lot of volume, but we're going to go pretty slow, actually slower than our typical race pace. Okay. Then we're going to have pace tempo. our intensity is going to increase. And remember, what is the fluctuation that has to occur when intensity increases? Our volume has to go down. Okay. So long, slow distance, we'd be able to, let's say we're going to go for a 2-hour run. I mean, that's a long time, but a 2-hour run. Whereas if we move from pace tempo, we're going a little bit faster. Now maybe we're going for a 45-minute run. And then increase in intensity even more. We talk about interval training. Now we're talking about intensities close to our VO2 max. So we're looking at intervals at about 3 to 5 minutes, and the work to rest ratio should be about 1 to 1. What do we mean by the work to rest ratio? Well, this is an easy one since it's 1 to 1. I plug my work amount into this side, and I get my rest ratio based on this. So for instance, if I want to perform bouts of 5 minutes, so 5 minutes of work, I'm going to run for 5 minutes. If the ratio should be 1 to 1, that means I need to rest 5 minutes in between my reps. Okay. Same thing with 3 minutes. 3 minutes of work, 1 to 1 ratio, I need to have 3 minutes of rest. Okay. And then fartlek training is similar to interval training, but instead, like say interval training, we have 5 minutes of work, 5 minutes of rest. The 5 minutes of rest, we're not doing anything. Whereas fartlek, it might be 5 minutes of work, and our rest time might be long, slow distance. So it's basically a combination of all of these different ones. Okay. That's the end. I know, trust me, I know that was a lot. But if you need to listen to it a second time, ask me questions, go through, and we'll make sure we understand this material.